My friends, in today's video we will do an exercise of imagination to try to answer this question. But before starting the video, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel, share the video and leave your comment telling us what you think would happen if Putin were ousted. Now let's go to the video. First of all, it is necessary to understand how Russia was formed and how it is divided. During the expansion process of the Russian Empire, it conquered various regions and incorporated them into the Russian Empire. However, despite these areas undergoing a process of Russification during the Soviet period, the cultural identities of certain cultures remained. We must also remember that Russia is not inhabited only by ethnic Russians. Ethnic Russians account for 82% of the total population, and the remaining 18% are composed of about 100 distinct ethnic groups. In this case, these are considered national minorities. We must also not forget about religious differences. Despite the vast majority being Orthodox Christian, there is a variety of religions among these ethnic minorities, such as regions with a Muslim majority. Among these minorities we can mention Adyghe, Balkars, Chechens, Circassians, Ingushs, Kabyrdins, Karachays, and various peoples of Dagestan. There are also Buddhist peoples such as in Buryatia, Tuva and Kalmykia, and we cannot forget about a Jewish minority throughout Russian territory. And many of these groups live in republics with a lot of autonomy, even being governed by almost dictatorial regimes in a kind of vassalage with the central government. An example of this is Ramzan Kadyrov's Chechnya. It is also important to note that within internationally recognized Russian borders there are 21 autonomous republics. That is, it is a huge territory with many cultural and political differences within the same territory. Now in a scenario of Putin's fall, how would these regions and their leaders position themselves? Now let's start doing the imagination exercise, remembering that this is a fictional scenario and it would be very unlikely to describe accurately how this would happen due to the complexity of the subject. Firstly, we have to describe how Putin's fall would happen, and given what happened in the case of Prigozhin's rebellion, it is possible to imagine that it would be something chaotic with many dissidents within the Russian army fighting for power. We must add to this the power acquired by the leader of Wagner's mercenary group and the ego and thirst for power of some regional ethnic leaders. It should be remembered that today in Russia there are already traditionally separatist regions, and here we can mention Chechnya, perhaps the most famous of all, but there is also Tatarstan region home to Tatars, a Muslim group, Kalmykia region, which is Europe's only Buddhist region, Kaliningrad enclave, a more westernized region so to speak, which in recent times has started to have an idea of more autonomy and even seeking independence. And finally Karachay-Cherkessia and Kabardino-Balkaria republics. These are Russia's main separatist regions. And with so many people fighting for power, there would be two scenarios. In the first one, a leader would emerge in Putin's place, managing to pacify the country, avoiding Russia's disintegration. In the second scenario, in a much more radical situation, there would be a struggle between various leaders, whether military or ethnic leaders, in a disintegration scenario much more similar to what happened in former Yugoslavia. Let us remember that this country was also a mixture of various peoples within one territory under strong leadership from General Josip Broz Tito, and after his death struggles began with each side seeking its independence, with Serbia wanting to maintain the territory and subjugate other nationalities. However, in the case of the Russian Federation, it is necessary to mention some much more impactful factors than in former Yugoslavia. The first and most obvious are the more than 6,000 nuclear warheads that, if they fall into the wrong hands, into the hands of radical leaders or into the hands of mercenaries thirsty for money and power, could certainly bring the world a scenario of greater nuclear instability. We must also add, of course, the war situation with Ukraine and the annexed regions, and given the bellicose and irresponsible declarations of some Russian leaders such as Medvedev, it is difficult to imagine that they would want to return Ukraine, or if they lose it at first, nothing guarantees that they will not try to retake it after the political chaos passes. The third point to be mentioned is the geopolitical situation, which, if it is not already good, could certainly get much worse with the rise of one or more authoritarian leaders. Although Putin is not an example of democratic leadership, he manages to keep the situation within normality. And with the described scenario imagining radicalization between all these forces, there would certainly be a civil war aiming for control of the country and ethnic leaders taking advantage of the situation to declare independence. The success of these regional leaders would depend on the situation of central power. If there was still a lot of struggle for power without a strong leadership already defined, these leaders such as Chechen Ramzan Kadyrov could indeed succeed, especially if they managed to obtain international support aimed at weakening Russian power. However, it would be difficult to imagine that Western leaders would force Russian disintegration, at least not so openly. This would clearly be much worse because despite there certainly being security measures for various scenarios, those responsible for maintaining the security of these weapons could be involved in the struggle for power, and thus such measures would not have the desired effect. And with this, Russian nuclear weapons could be divided among radical leaders, which could cause even more instability in Europe. In the second scenario, the struggles could last for months or even years, causing even greater instability in Europe with the serious risk of spreading throughout the continent. And if one of the parties involved in the struggle for control of the country or seeking independence of a region is in possession of a nuclear device, what makes us believe that weak leaders not tied to any state policy and acting only thinking about power would be responsible in possession of such powerful weapons? Seeing recent statements from some Russian leaders and imagining a scenario of radicalization would be quite worrying. In a very summarized way, it would be difficult to imagine that after Vladimir Putin's abrupt fall things would normalize just following democratic law guidelines. There would probably be, at least initially, a lot of struggle to see who would assume power, and if a leader did not manage to take control and pacify the country quickly, we would have radicalization with confrontation between military factions, leading to a process of disintegration of the immense Russian territory in something similar to what happened in Yugoslavia. Such processes tend to be quite violent, and in this case Russian nuclear weapons would be an extra concern for the world as a whole. I need to emphasize once again that this was a reflection process on what could happen if Putin were ousted, emphasizing that this is very difficult to predict given the complexity of understanding what is going on within Russia and its leadership. I want you to leave a comment telling us what you think would happen if Vladimir Putin were ousted from power. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel. This helps us grow the channel, and my thank you very much, and see you in the next video.